Let's talk Intercessors and Tactical Marines, Incursors and Infiltrators, with a look at which Space Marine troops choices are strongest in current Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk Space Marine troops and do a bit of a fun data-driven look at what's strongest in game at the moment, and which flavours of power armour the top Space Marine lists are choosing to include, and how many of them. Let's talk about troops in general, how many people are fielding in lists, and then go through each one of the troops' choices in turn, how I'd run them in game at the moment, and how popular they are in the top tournament lists. So which troops' choices are looking best in Arks of Omen? First up, just for an overview, Space Marine troops have changed really quite a lot in the Arks of Omen update. Perhaps the most interesting thing about them is they've gained that sticky objectives rule, meaning that if you move off the objective remains yours. Really quite a nice little ability. I think that usually you would want to stay on objectives, but it gives you a little bit more flexibility, particularly in the late game where it might make sense to leave behind a far-flung objective and go to fight for a middle one that your opponent might currently hold. Otherwise, their points costs took a bit of a shake-up, as you can see here. Literally all war gear for all the standard Space Marine troops choices became free, and a fair few of them dropped in points as well besides the Tactical Marines, though they certainly came off best in terms of free war gear to add into the squad. The cheaper points are certainly a bit of a trade-off for losing Armour of Contempt, which has made them less durable, but Space Marine troops certainly cost you less than they've generally been before. Assault Intercessors are 17 points, Heavies are 23, Intercessors, Incursors and Tactical Marines are all 18, and the Infiltrator squad is 20. The other big change for troops, though, is that they became optional in Arks of Omen. You don't necessarily need to include any of them in a Space Marine list if you don't want to, and Space Marines certainly aren't short of big damage dealers in the other slots. Previously, in Nephilim, most Space Marine lists tended to be running battalions and using 3 troops to fill up one of those, so I was very interested to see how many people will be choosing in Arks of Omen when they don't necessarily have to take them. With all that in mind, I've gone through a big cross-section of Space Marine tournament lists, all of them in Arks of Omen tournaments, over the past few weeks, just to see what people are using. All of these placed in the top 10% of tournaments, either doing fairly well at big ones or outright winning small RTTs. That should hopefully select for Space Marine lists that are actually doing well, as opposed to just people bringing whatever they feel like. So I thought it would be interesting to see how many troops people are running, and which troops are considered the best in competitive games at the moment. So first up, we have the question of whether people are running troops in Space Marine lists at all. Admittedly, they're not the most efficient damage dealers, competing against some great elites, fast attack and heavy support choices for this, and are now completely optional. They're not even the cheapest infantry units, as you could be running things like eliminators for that if you wanted. So now Space Marine lists are no longer incentivized to take battalions. How many are people running? The answer to that appears to be yes, they're still running plenty, though people do seem to be running a bit less than they were before. Out of the 40 lists that I looked at, 3 of them took 0 troops. I think at least 2 of those were Dark Angels as well, who are kind of incentivized not to access things like their unique Ravenwing or Deathwing detachments, though even there the majority of Dark Angel lists don't seem to bother with those and do take some troops along. Otherwise 9 lists just ran the 1 troops choice, and this often tended to be Phobos Marines just for utility. 18 lists ran 2, 6 lists ran 3 troop selections, 3 lists ran 4 of them, and 1 list ran 5 troops. They're certainly not being spammed to any great extent. The ones that took more troops often tended to be a little bit more of the battle line type flavour, armies that were actually trying to use their troops as damage dealers, perhaps a few more that started in deployment zones like Assault Intercessors or Heavy Intercessors and things. I'm glad they've not just completely evaporated. I was wondering whether or not they'd be quite rare in Arks of Omen, given that Space Marine players can access rights of war to get objectives secured, but it does seem that with the reduced points cost, Games Workshop has managed to make them useful enough. Obviously they bring objectives secured, and that's a big advantage to scoring you the victory points, but on top of that, a few missions actually favour troops quite heavily, giving you a few extra command points or other things like that that just troops can do. And in particular, the Phobos troops have a fair bit of utility. Starting on the midfield and doing early actions is quite nice, and taking those points early. And Infiltrators perhaps have a bit of a special role with the 12 inches deep strike denial. That's quite handy to have in a list for just 20 points per model. I'd argue that maybe not that many people are running troops to be durable though, which is perhaps one of their other big things. I feel like in the Space Marine Codex, things like Thunderhammer Stormshield Terminators might just be a bit more tough per point at the moment, which might be going some way to cramping the style of Heavy Intercessors. Overall, it looks like troops are alive and well for Space Marines. Competitive lists seem to take around 2 choices at 2,000 points. Then that moves us on to the question as to which troops are best, which are being used the most in these top lists. I thought we'd go through them each in turn, starting with the least commonly played and going through to the most, and talk a bit about how I'd think about using them in game as we go. I would bear in mind that the best troops might depend a bit on the chapter that you're playing. Some chapters just get on a lot better with certain troops choices, say Salamanders with Tactical Marines and the Melters, or potentially Ultramarines with the Phobos troops. They get to redeploy them with rapid redeployments, and that can be fairly big with units that you put quite far forward. There were also a few oddball troops in the sample, things that are only usable for certain armies, and they don't really compare that well with the rest, as obviously they need to be weighed up for other Space Wolf list or Black Templars. The only unique Space Marine troops out of this selection were 2 sets of Black Templar Crusader squads and 2 sets of Space Wolf Grey Hunters. Out of the Black Templar and Space Wolf lists, they did seem to be at least fairly viable for them, though not every army chose to pick them up, and a couple just went with generic selections and completely ignored them. There was also a conspicuous lack of any Deathwatch kill teams in the list. They do seem to be having issues at the moment, without very many people playing Deathwatch at all. Moving on to the troops choice list proper though, and in 6th place I'm afraid it is the regular Firstborn. There were only 2 tactical squads taken out of all of these lists, despite their handout of free war gear. The Firstborn Space Marines cost 18 points, they're not as strong in combat as their primaris counterparts, only having the 1 attack, and they get the standard issue bolters, which are inferior to the bolt rifles of the Intercessors. In Arks of Omen with their free gear though, you can amp them up quite a bit. For just a 90-point unit, you can have a basic squad, but then throw in a multi-melter into it, which is pretty scary. And on the Sergeant, I'd be most tempted by a combi melter for another big melter shot, plus a Thunder Hammer to give the squad some muscle in close. I feel like on paper they actually don't compete too badly with the other troops choices, and they're definitely a bit more interesting in certain chapters. Salamanders, as mentioned, for a buff to melter is really nice. Iron Hands is quite nice to be able to move and shoot that multi-melter and reroll ones, and perhaps Ultramarines again to move and shoot without penalty, and also rapid fire your bolters out to max range. Unfortunately, I do think that tactical squads are just in a bit of an awkward spot. I feel like a lot of people are going to look at tactical marines and then just think that you could run something like a Devastator squad or Stern Guard for not really all that many more points. You do give up objectives secured, but then you just get a massive increase in firepower, either 4 heavy weapons and a combi out of the Devastators, or 3 combis and 2 multi-melters out of a Stern Guard squad. I feel like that kind of firepower is worth trading out objectives secured for. It's just so much more raw damage dealing for a small extra investment that I feel like most people will be tempted to do that rather than taking the TAC Marines. I feel like they'd also probably be played a little bit more if armies were forced to take 3 troops like they were with battalions. A few armies that just want more raw damage dealing would probably pick them up, but now you're not. If you just want damage, then it's better to go elsewhere. Moving up, and in 5th place we've got the Heavy Intercessors. Again, it seems like these guys are struggling a fair bit compared with the field. Only 4 selections out of the 40 lists looked at. Again, I feel like, as with the tactical squads, at least on paper, the Heavy Intercessors were one of the most improved units going into Arks of Omen. They dropped from 28 points all the way down to 23, which is kind of massive. And for their points cost, they are at least fairly tanky. 115 points to put 15 Gravis armoured wounds on an objective is going to be annoying to get rid of. Their main deal is that they get the 3 wounds at toughness 5 per model, and then they strike out at the enemy with those extra big bolters, the unifying thing being a strength of 5 and a bonus of range compared with standard Intercessors. They can take a heavy bolter in the unit, but they don't get any melee gear on the Sergeant, and that's a bit of a downside when the Tactical Marines, Intercessors and Assault Intercessors all get that included for free now. Out of the 4 selections, 3 of these came from the exact same Iron Hands list that we use in the Executor Bolt rifles. I guess being able to move and shoot and re-rolling those ones to hit make them a bit more usable. They do hit pretty hard with a big strength 5, AP -2 and damage 3, and very good range. I'd say as they go they're probably a bit better in Imperial Fists, Iron Hands for the move and shoot with the big rifles, and Ultramarines being able to move and rapid fire with the regular heavy bolt rifles. As mentioned, I feel like they're probably in a bit of an awkward place between not being quite the toughest thing in the codex compared with things like Thunderhammer Terminators, who also deal good damage, and maybe not quite having as much threat as some of the other troops units, or not being as happy wading forward and taking the midfield. I feel like for loadout choice for these guys, Games Workshop actually have them fairly well balanced at the moment. Depending on the chapter and the synergies, I think you could easily make an argument for any of the 3 main heavy bolt rifle variants. I don't have enormously strong feelings between the 3. Moving on, and just nosing very slightly ahead of the Heavy Intercessors, we have the Standard Intercessors. They were taken 5 selections, still not really all that much over 40 lists. In general, over late 8th and early 9th edition, the Intercessors have been a fairly staple troops choice, usually worth the couple of extra points over standard Tactical Marines to get some significantly better bolt rifle shooting, plus a bit more melee. With their free gear and things, I think the loadout that would most tempt me for an Intercessor squad would be a small loadout of 5 of them with a Thunder Hammer on the Sergeant, auto bolt rifles in most chapters to spam out a bunch of anti-infantry shots, and the Astartes grenade launcher on one model. A few chapters might want a bit different though. Iron Hands probably want the heavy ones, and Ultramarines would like the standard bolt rifle, having the 2 shots out to 30 inches when they're in their tactical doctrine. In general, I do think they're a fairly well balanced unit, could either sit on home field objectives and defend them, or wade into the midfield and get mixed up in combat with that Thunderhammer. And I feel like just about every chapter can make fairly good use of them being pretty much the default primaris troops, with a bit of shooting and a bit of melee. I feel like perhaps White Scars are particularly interesting for them with the auto bolt rifles. They get to advance, shoot at full effect, and charge at full effect, which is quite big. But otherwise I'd say that most of the other chapters aren't enormously standout. Moving on and going up in the world a bit, in third place we have the Assault Intercessors. These guys seem to have been taken significantly more over the list compared with the standard Intercessors, 10 selections out of the 40 armies. Assault Intercessors drop down to 17 points per model, and that does make them the cheapest troops choice out of the Space Marine generic section. Their pistols are heavy bolt pistols with an AP-1 there, plus a whole flurry of attacks at AP-1 in combat, and you want to take the Thunderhammer I think on the Sergeant for some big damage 3 hits. The Sergeant should probably pick up a hand flamer or plasma pistol for free as well. I think I'd probably be most tempted by the plasma. These guys do seem to be a bit more popular than the standard Intercessors, and as you might expect seem to be particularly favoured by melee chapters, Space Wolves, Black Templars and Blood Angels perhaps making particularly good use of them. I kind of feel like their Astartes chainsword attacks might just be a little bit more better in against the meta now that Armour of Contempt has largely gone away. AP-1 was just a little bit unreliable, and these guys are basically an AP-1 unit all around. In any case, seems solid enough if you want a fighter units to push into the midfield and be some bodies on objectives to take the fight to the enemy. Moving up to second place and just pipping out the Assault Intercessors with 11 selections are the Incursors. These guys are the cheaper variation of Phobos troops at 18 points per model now. Their weapons are the Oculus Bolt carbines, basically ignoring cover and ignoring ballistic skill penalties, but in general not hitting any harder than a standard bolt gun. I'd say the main reason to take these is to start on the midfield objective, nice cheap units to put some objectives secured there and do some early actions like raise some banners or something. And plus the Incursors have a couple of other really nice advantages, a little bit more melee power than things like Infiltrators with the extra AP of their combat blades, and they also get their fun Haywire mine included for free now. If a squad gets charged for the first time, on a 2+, the enemy takes D3 mortal wounds, or a big 3 if it was a vehicle doing the charging. Not too bad for punishing some Chaos Knights or something for daring to engage them in melee. In general, with the Phobos units, I'd take them in minimum size units. I feel like they perhaps have good value in most chapters, perhaps particularly Ultramarines for that rapid redeployment stratagem to pull them back to safety if you're just going to lose them turn 1. And in general, for any of the melee chapters that are going to be spending some time in Assault Doctrine, Blood Angels, Space Wolves, White Scars and Black Templars can all get a bit more value out of them, I think. The melee certainly shouldn't be underestimated for those guys, perhaps Blood Angels in particular. Overall seems a very solid unit, but I'm afraid it is a fair bit behind their Phobos counterparts, the Infiltrator squad. So that brings us to our first place choice on the list, and the Infiltrators are the most popular troops choice to be run in competitive Space Marine armies, and it's really not even close in any way, shape or form. In fact, such is their dominance that out of this entire sample, there were more Infiltrator squads put together than all of the other Space Marine troops choices combined. It looks like these pretty much flat out are the competitive way to go for Space Marine troops at the moment, and people are fairly agreed that they've got a fair bit more utility than the rest. Infiltrators also got a very big points boost in Arks of Omen. They dropped down from 24 points to 20. They were charged at a bit of a premium before for that comms array and the deep strike denial bubble, but now that premium really isn't much higher than the other Space Marine troops units, and they've also given them a free Helix Gauntlet as well, which is pretty awesome in itself. Statline wise, these guys aren't particularly standout. They've got the normal stat line that an Intercessor has, with 2 wounds, 2 attacks, and they guns the Marksman Bolt Carbine, just a standard bolter, but unmodified hit rolls of a 6 automatically wound the target. It's not a bad boost, but it doesn't really work out to be stronger than standard Intercessor bolt rifles, at least per point. It's really not their damage that set these guys ahead though. First up, they are the Phobos units that can forward deploy. Again, like the Incursors, that makes them great for taking those midfield objectives early, raising banners and things. That's a very good start for utility outside what most Space Marine units can do. That deep strike denial bubble at just 100 points really is a big deal though. I feel like at 120 points people were struggling to justify it compared with what they could get for things like Incursors, but I think particularly in Arks of Omen it is a much bigger deal than it used to be. and there are a fair few armies that it's really going to mess with. Obviously, Genestealer Cult are going to be very unhappy to see Infiltrators on the other side of the table, but also armies like Chaos Demons with their easy access deep strike that can potentially drop quite close, and a lot of factions in general are using strategic reserves as well. Now they became free, there's a lot more incentive. Weirdly, Infiltrators are both a really interesting unit to hold down a home field objective as well as deploy in the midfield, as if you just leave a unit behind on the home field one, you absolutely guarantee that enemy deep strikers can't come in within 12 of them, so under normal circumstances they can never ever get charged from reserve, and it means that the home field objective is basically safe from deep strikers, at least on the turn that they came down. I think that kind of insurance maybe makes people want to take them more than things like heavy intercessors or tactical marines, where the damage or defense buffs that those guys have just maybe isn't quite enough to outweigh that complete insurance on the objective. If you have a couple of units as well, you can potentially do quite big plays against armies where deep strike denial is big. A couple of units deployed really spread out could deny your opponent an enormous section of the board to come down in. Against the right army, that could be really nasty. Finally, for their big improvement, there's the Helix Gauntlet. That one's basically the medic style upgrade for them, and it's now free. And the rule is that once per turn, the first time that you fail a save, you basically negate the damage and it becomes 0. It's quite a powerful rule, to be honest. Just by having the upgrade, you've basically 100% guaranteed that you saved 10 points worth of Infiltrator, 1 wound out of 2. And if they were targeted by something like a heavy weapon or a melter gun or something, you've probably just saved an entire Infiltrator then and there. Durability is one of the biggest deals for troops, as it's more about surviving on the objectives than actually killing the enemy that they care about. That's what the rest of the army is for. With access to the Helix Gauntlet, they can basically be at least as durable as things like Intercessors or Assault Intercessors, and are likely to pull significantly ahead if the enemy doesn't wipe them out in a single turn, and the Helix Gauntlet's triggers on 2 different turns throughout the game. Overall, from the balance of utility and what the rest of the army brings, the Primaris Infiltrators do seem to be the best Space Marine troop choice right now. They seem to appear in various different combinations and lists, though maybe just 2 units of Infiltrators in the troop section seems to be the single most common. Let me know what you think though, which troops have been working best for your army, and how many troops have you been running in Arks of Omen, if any. It'll be interesting to get a few further takes. I would bear in mind though, while it looks like Infiltrators might be the optimal one, I feel like most of the rest of the troop section really isn't all that much far behind. Pretty much all of them got some fairly solid buffs going into Arks of Omen. I still think things like multiple squads of big heavy intercessor units might be pretty intimidating against the right matchup. Besides, it can just be fun to run things in a bit of variety. Rule of cool and experimenting with 40k units is part of what makes 40k fun after all. At the moment though, it does look like the Infiltrators are the ones to beat, the overlords of the competitive Space Marine troops choice right now. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Space Marines in the future. If you've enjoyed this one, I'll leave a link down to my Aggressors unit review down in the video description. Feel free to check that one out if you'd like to see another Space Marine video. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's how I can afford to keep on making quite so many videos like this quite so often. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.